This is the Better Software Faster podcast, where we deep dive into the intersection of tech and business to demystify, unravel, and explore concepts that you can apply to your own organization. From pipelines to processes, forecasting to fine-tuning, best practices to balance sheets, we draw on all of our customer-facing experience to bring you the best high-level talking points. Hello and welcome to the BSF podcast episode 4. I'm Adam Godwin, your host, and joining me today is our head of engineering, Joe Poser. Joe, welcome.
Thank you for having me, I guess. Yeah.
And Joe, you've been with ReleaseWorks pretty much since the start of ReleaseWorks.
It is pushing half a decade now, which is mildly terrifying to me. Time moves incredibly fast. Yeah. Do you want to just give a little intro about yourself and your backstory, your journey? Yeah, sure. I came into engineering, I guess, a bit later. I've always been, I guess, like most people of our generation, like computers have been around since we were quite young, and I think when we were a bit younger, they didn't work as well, so you kind of had to fix things a lot. I think. Yeah, playing computer games in the 90s sets you up pretty well for solving hard problems with computers because, like, honestly, the problems that we solve now are possibly easier than getting, I don't know, like X-Wing working on a Windows 98 computer with no joystick, which is a weird analogy, I guess. But yeah, I did quite a lot of, I came out of university, ended up doing quite a lot of office administration. Everyone was sort of asking me to fix computers. So I thought, well, maybe I should take this a bit more seriously. Taught myself how to program. I learned Python from a book and various online resources. Got really into Linux, which is something that I've sort of been playing around with again since I was, quite young, because it was a good way of getting old laptops to work. In like the early 2000s, ended up getting a job as a Linux sysadmin in the fintech industry. Sort of at the start of when like DevOps and cloud was like making some really big waves. So like, Docker was kind of kicking off. I did some pretty early implementations of Kubernetes for building CI resources. Did an awful lot of managing of like Jenkins instances and helping people out with delivery pipelines, fixing delivery pipelines for like Java applications, deploying servers, and then made the move into cloud. Been in cloud engineering for, I guess, around 5, must be pushing like 8 years now. We've been working across AWS, Azure, GCP, building, a huge range of implementations from like containerized applications through to things, running in virtual machines, serverless. And in recent years, I've made the move into engineering leadership, which is quite a big change in my career, which I think we're going to talk about, right?
We are, yes. The title of the episode is Growing Technical Leadership, and it's going to be all about the transition and the journey. And what sparked this off was there was a LinkedIn post that was doing the rounds, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, from somebody who declared that they would never hire a CTO who didn't code. Not so much that they would be expected to code within the role, but that they wouldn't hire somebody who hadn't gone up through the ranks, right from like entry-level coding all the way through the management pipeline to CTO, rather than having say someone with an MBA who's more of a CTO out of the box, strategic thinker, but not with the technical background, nuts and bolts. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have opinions on that. I have quite strong opinions on that. I think it's always good to have people who are grounded when in leadership roles. I think it's it's definitely good to have people who've been there in the metaphorical trenches writing code, but I personally don't think it's essential. I don't know if hiring someone out of an MBA role, but like if you're discounting people who've potentially come from like wildly divergent career paths and have ended up in in and around software development roles, maybe you've become a scrum master and you've been helping teams, or like an agile coach, and you've become fantastic at teaching teams how to deliver amazing software that delights and is exactly what your end users want, and teams love to work with you, then I see no reason why someone like that could not end up in an engineering leadership role. I don't think writing code really is, I don't think it's essential personally. That's my initial read on that. I suspect that's probably why they wrote the post, is probably because most people think that, and they're bound to get lots of clicks on LinkedIn. But that's a different kettle of fish, right?
Oh no, for sure it's engagement bait, but it was working, and
it's clearly worked with us, right? Like
there seemed to be a lot of strong arguments on both sides. It wasn't like everybody was dogpiling the author. There were plenty of people fighting his camp and also against as well. And I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience. I've had a sales manager who didn't have a sales background. You can be a fantastic manager of people. Where I feel like maybe it caps is that you remain a manager of people. You can't necessarily be an effective leader. You couldn't lead your troops into battle unless you were also a soldier. But that might just be from my sales world. I don't know how much that applies to your engineering world.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you definitely often encounter, like I've worked with, a huge amount of different engineering leadership, and most of them have come from, at least have done some amount of software engineering. I think it's quite unusual. I think where it kind of rubs me up wrong, right, is it's just like the blanket discounting, right? It doesn't. I think I react strongly to people who are going like, I would never do this. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's, what if they're amazing? Like, what if they're amazing? They really understand, the software delivery space. They really understand how, engineers work and how to get the best out of them. Like, why wouldn't you hire that person? Like, just because they haven't written code? That makes no sense. But I suspect they, whoever wrote that would probably acknowledge that. And they're just saying that most people who haven't written code probably don't understand software engineering, which is probably true.
I recognize now maybe I should have had two people on here, right, to have a live debate.
Yeah, maybe
that would be the engagement.
You just got my opinion.
That's fine. Well, I was going to say with because you outlined a secondary path there, right, which is that you could have somebody with a more of like an agile coach, scrum master background, paving the way into being a technical leadership role. So if we say that there's 3 categories for the sake of argument, you've got your kind of like yourself coming sysadmin, cloud engineer, and then technical, head of engineering, and then you've got your sort of in the technical sphere but not necessarily a coder themselves, scrum masters, and then you've got the third category, which is like a high level strategic manager who doesn't have the background at all. Do you feel like there would be specific advantages and disadvantages for each of those 3 people if they all ascended to the same level at the same time?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think there's definitely things you gain from being an engineer. There's like an understanding of, of the craft of software development that you will get, that you might not necessarily get if you're an agile leader. But my recent experience of doing engineering management, the reality is you don't have time to really be getting too deep on implementations. You have to be, intervening where you can have the most impact, in limited amounts of time, because you will be working across multiple projects. You will have to keep an awful lot of things in your head. And I think those skills are probably more important, being able to plan, being able to know what your engineers are best at. I think that's probably more important than, how good you are at, writing, concise API specs and nice interfaces for classes and things like that. I think, and on that basis, I think probably some of the more important things I would look for in engineering management is the ability to manage projects, right? And know how things are delivered, because that's probably the thing that most software engineers, when you're starting out in your software engineering career, right, you are handed tickets, you're handed tasks, and
Sure.
you have to deliver them, right? And some of that stuff is very hard, but I don't think it necessarily lends itself to planning. And what I've noticed is I've been kind of pushing my engineers, because I want my engineers to to grow and develop. And I think some of the things that separates a software engineer from a senior software engineer, in my opinion, is that ability to kind of have that wider perspective, understand why they're writing code, as opposed to just being given a set of tasks and going away and doing it. And I think that's probably, to me, more important. Whether you need to have done a bit of that, I think it helps. Probably, I'm almost certain it does help. I just don't think it's essential.
Yeah, I imagine it would help quite a lot with setting expectations as well, in terms of sort of scoping out work. And
and like knowing how long things take, right? Knowing why sometimes engineering is one of those strange disciplines, because it is actually it's very much creative endeavor a lot of the time, right? Like you're making something that didn't exist before. So one of the things that engineering managers and people employing engineers find very difficult is an awful lot of work. You can be very clear about how long it's going to take. Like, if you're fixing a car, if you've done 200 of them, you probably know it takes half a day to, I don't know, take out an engine and replace a water pump or something like that. Whereas if you're building out a new API and it's using a new technology that your engineers haven't come across before, everyone wants to you want an estimate, but estimation is incredibly difficult.
As we've seen. I want to I would definitely want to come back to the time question that you raised, but just before then, so you've run the gamut, right? So you came in as a cloud engineer, then senior cloud engineer, then lead cloud engineer. Now you're head of engineering and you're managing multiple teams. Quite a big journey and transition.
Yes.
Are you finding as you're kind of progressing through, you are now having to start giving stuff up to make space for everything else that you need to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's the first thing that you have to do. Even you have to have people that you can trust, and you have to trust people, and you have to accept that sometimes they're going to get into trouble, and they're going to fail, and that sometimes that is and that is a useful process, right? We've all failed in work, and I think if someone says that everything that they've done has worked perfectly well, they're just liars, right? It goes for basically everything in life. You have to do things to understand them, and you have to you learn a lot more when something goes wrong than you do when it goes right. I've found that I have to hand over huge amounts of things, and there's a lot more coaching people on how to do things like run Jira boards, right? Stuff that seems quite basic, but if you've not had to do it before, then you don't know. And we quite often hire people who are we take pride in that we hire people who tend to come from quite early on in their career, and they won't be the finished article, right? So
Oh yeah, sure.
so yeah, there's definitely a lot more. There's definitely a lot more coaching. There's definitely a lot more keeping track of, projects at milestones, and trying to understand if something's going wrong, like why it's going wrong, and coming up with solutions that don't tend to be, software related, right? Like they're almost always people related.
That's a very interesting point. So as part of the abstraction, you are kind of moving a bit more away from the code and into what we might call like people problems, or
Yeah,
more like solution orientated conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's understanding who's the right person to place on a project. What skills might they be missing that you might need to support them on, to get them going. If they're making a mistake, sometimes you have to, let them continue making a mistake for a little bit of time before they'll acknowledge that they've made a mistake.
Sure.
Those can be really useful teaching examples. We've had quite a number of projects that have been across time zones, and that makes communication really hard. I strongly believe that communication makes a huge impact on how organizations operate, and organizations that don't communicate effectively don't operate effectively. And the time zone thing makes communication very hard. And I've had specific instances where people have maybe not worked as hard at the communication, and I've had to things have slipped, and I've had to come in and go like, look, you have to do it. If you don't do it, then things aren't going to happen. Right.
It's one of the things we're quite rigorous about in the interview process as well. Making sure that I wouldn't go as far as to say you have to be a good communicator first and a good programmer second. But if you don't have both of those as a baseline,
I potentially would.
Never going to be.
Like I potentially would personally. Like you can teach people how to be good software engineers. Teaching them how to be good communicators is sometimes harder, right? Yeah.
Well, let's let's talk about the kind of the difference then between sort of like management and leadership. So when you were in your lead role, you were, and hopefully I won't get in trouble for saying this, but you were kind of the adult in the room when it came to a client-facing engagement. As you said, engineers are working off of a ticket backlog that you've established, but the lead is sort of the project key contact, right, for the client, and that means all of the responsibilities on them as well. When you move into a more of a head of engineering role, you're no longer the lead. You're now having like a stable of leads and have to have really, really high levels of trust. So how do you kind of lead from the front with that then, when you're not necessarily directly involved in the projects your leads are working on?
For me, the big thing is I want my engineers and I want my leads to trust me, and if they trust me, then they will tell me when things go wrong. Like I don't want people hiding things. If people are scared of coming to you when there are problems, then you won't know about it, and then you're having to deal with it when it's not just a problem. You're having to deal with it when it's a crisis, and crisis management is much more difficult than going like, okay, this isn't working, like what can we do? So it comes back to a communication point, right? Like it's making sure that you're talking to people as much as possible. You're giving them plenty of opportunities to tell you what's going on. You're listening out for them, telling you when something isn't working, and working out if that's the point that, if there's something that you need to intervene in, right? I think that's probably the big thing. It's much less focusing on individual tasks and whether they're getting done, but whether people are comfortable on a project, whether they're feel that they have what they need to deliver it, if there's any gaps, and how can you plug those gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the trust in communication is such a key skill in management of all walks, right? But it's that classic conundrum where you don't want to be seen as micromanaging anybody by getting sort of so ultra zoomed in on the day to day, but you need to be able to engender that feeling of trust where they can come to you without a fear of repercussion. I know that might sound savage, but I think we've probably both had managers who would fall into that camp.
Yeah, and like I just don't think it ever works, right? I think if you've got a micromanager, you just end up with a bottleneck, right? And if you need to get a lot of things done, then you have to let go, right? You have to, you might care about implementation, but sometimes you just have to trust that people know what's best, right? And you will end up knowing, the people who are good at implementations and who you can push that out to. But yeah, if you're focused on individual things, then you're going to get what's the word? You're going to get tunnel vision very fast, and then you're going to miss an awful lot of big trees that are coming at you.
That's a great point and a great way of phrasing it as well. Okay, brilliant. Well, when you're sort of like leading these teams, right? Do you have kind of a feedback framework in place, or sort of how do you manage all of your moving parts while keeping your focus on the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think regular one-to-ones, right? Like I think it's really simple, right? Like, but making sure you have regular one-to-ones with a framework around them, that's hugely important, because that gives you a picture of what's going on within teams. I still lead quite junior engineers, so I am still quite hands-on with them, and forward planning as well. I think forward planning's a huge part of it. Is understanding what your current resources are, what your current what your future resource requirements are going to be, and making sure that you've got your engineers have the skills ahead of time so that they can be successful on the projects that they're going to be placed on. And if you don't have the engineers available, then, maybe going out and getting some, right? Yeah.
Do you take quite a hands-on approach with new starters that are joining one of your teams?
It will depend, right? If they're working on projects that I'm very directly related on, but I think it's more important that they spend a lot of time with the engineers that they're going to be working with closely, right? I'm a big advocate of some of the what's probably now quite they're quite old ideas, right? But I think pair programming, I think is a hugely valuable thing, in that you get the benefit of upskilling engineers and a wider perspective on a problem than you would if you just have people working on their own on tasks. So I encourage engineers to pair up a huge amount. I think that's hugely valuable. So that's what I want new starters to be doing, is I want them working with the engineers they're going to be collaborating with closely, giving them whatever they need to get things going. But yeah, I think that's the important thing to me.
Yeah, lots of shadowing as well.
Yeah, basically that's shadowing.
Yeah,
they do some shadowing, but it's not just a brief period of shadowing, right? Like engineers should be working on problems together. So that it just solves so many problems, and it makes things go much faster, and I think people enjoy it more as well. Like I don't. We have a major problem in the industry, I think, now that we were already quite atomized when we were sat in cubicles or in open planned offices, but now a lot of now most of our engineers are working from home. So giving them opportunities to spend time with each other, even if it is virtually, I think is hugely valuable.
I agree.
And necessary.
Yeah. You've got to really know your squad, right? If this was the military, you'd have to know your squadron inside out. And I guess when you're having your teams functioning together, they're not just performing tasks at the same pace. They've got to fill in each other's blind spots. They have to cover each other. They have to provide expertise, and it's really important that they trust each other to be able to ask openly.
Well, it's I don't hugely like military analogies, but I think it's easy to slip into them, right? Because militaries have some of the highest requirements for collaboration, because if you don't collaborate, then extremely bad things happen. We're fortunate in software engineering where the stakes are significantly lower.
Until you have a critical failure and suddenly the phone's ringing off the hook about all the money you're burning.
There are situations where things can be very bad, but hopefully people aren't going to. Hopefully it's not going to. Well, I mean, it'll depend on the projects you're looking after. In those situations, maybe you do need the military analogies, right? But I think just a simple, two pairs of eyes and two brains on a subject will give you a much wider view of the problem than one person's perspective, right?
Agreed. And when you moved into kind of a head of engineering role, there's another pivot here, which is that up until now you're kind of focused on number one, right? You're working on your career progression, but now that you're in a head of engineering role, you have people underneath you. You're now responsible for their career progression as well. Yeah, and I know we as a company, we've always had a very strong ethos about personal development. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you manage that and growing your team in more ways than one?
I care about it a lot, actually. I think everyone's been in jobs where they've felt that that career progression is not being offered to them, and we try to, or at least I definitely try to, encourage people to upskill themselves, first and foremost, and depending on where they are in their kind of career trajectory, I'd like to try and find projects where you can not throw people in at the deep end, but push them outside of what they're used to doing. So if they've worked on projects where they've been handed backlogs and they've worked through backlogs, right? Find situations where you can work with them to develop backlogs and manage the the flow of work through them. Giving people opportunities to to do some we do quite a lot of agile project management here at ReleaseWorks. So in those situations, giving people opportunities to do things like run sprint planning and retrospectives. I think that's really important, and you've got to find the opportunities to do that. Sometimes it can be quite challenging because you have to have the correct projects coming through to allow for that, and there is the inevitable issue where you start to get a bit of a bottleneck as as people move up, right? There's only so many project management roles in comparison to engineering roles. We're probably a bit more fortunate in in consultancy where it's expected that people will have to try new things. So our engineers tend to have quite broad skill sets, and I push them into uncomfortable situations to try get them to try things, and then you have to be there ready to catch them when they get into trouble.
I suppose the old saying is pressure makes diamonds, right? You force them to be
Yeah, but I
uncomfortable,
think
a little bit uncomfortable.
yeah, you want to make them feel uncomfortable, but you also want to give them confidence, right? Because an awful lot of the things that you're asking them to do aren't necessarily difficult. They're just, you just need to know how to do it. And you just need to have done it a bit. So, you let them, you show them how to do it. You let them run with it for a little bit. You check back in and go like, how are you getting on? What are you running into any problems? You sit in on, I'll sit in on planning sessions that are being run by other team members. I think that's one of the big ones, right? This, that, if you're putting someone into a more of a leadership role that you would have done, whether if it's like client facing or, they're leading a team, letting them do it, right? Like, and not stepping in and stepping on top of the things that they're trying to do. And then maybe if you've got advice for them, coming to them afterwards and going like, I think that was really good, but you can, maybe if you just try doing, maybe you just try doing this, things would go better, right? Maybe if you use a bit of more, use the board to help you, guide your agile stand-ups, you'll be able to keep track of things a little bit better, and just little things like that. And it adds up, right? Like, I've got engineers that have come to us who are extremely green, who are now leading projects, and I am hugely proud of them.
That is great to see.
It's probably
really great to see.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I didn't necessarily think I'd be doing this kind of thing in work, and I was very focused on, because I came into software engineering a bit later, I was very focused on technical skills, improving like my technical skills, learning things, also because I enjoyed it, right? And that was very satisfying, but I wasn't ready for the pride that you get when you've asked someone to do something that that they've not done before, and then they do really well. You're just like, oh that's and a huge amount of that is them, right, as well. They respond well to being challenged, but I think most people want it, right?
I think, if you've got that sort of spark of ambition, and we've definitely had some success stories. I mean, you are a success story, but we've had some of our engineers who they sit on a few projects, they do a few engagements, and then you turn around one day to them and say, right, we have a new engagement starting, we don't have a lead, and you're going to lead it, and they get thrust into it, and they kind of look like they're bricking it to begin with, and then they just fly when they get in front of the customer, and you have this amazing feeling that they've hit this new level.
Yeah, and I think a huge amount of that comes down to working with, if you work around people who are extremely competent, you can't really help but take on board some of their habits, right? So there's definitely a bit of that, but also I think one of the big advantages of working in a consultancy rather than as a sole consultant, right, is that you've got people around you that can support you, and that's the thing that I've tried to, I'm trying, the Miro before us, or before me, engendered, and one of the things that I'm looking to to carry on, right? We want to push people into situations where they're maybe not so comfortable with the knowledge that if things go wrong, they're not going to be on their own, right? We will circle around them and help them, and bring people in to to get things over the line, and that's what we do.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, I would probably just like to close off then by just talking a little bit about the skills that you've had to develop in keeping with the topic of the podcast, kind of moving into more of a managerial position, and more of a leadership position. you're obviously having to grow some new skills that never would have applied to your previous role. And as you continue in the role, you're probably going to continue growing those, for the sake of continual progression. So can you talk a little bit more about that side of things?
Yeah, I think probably one of the big ones is organization, right? Like, I mean, organization is critical for basically every job that you'll do, right? But you have to get even better at it, right? You have to be on top. You have to be on top of. You have to be on top of what's happening. But I think probably the biggest one is it's a different type of communication, right? It's learning. When you can push someone, when you might need to, back off a bit and like give them a bit of space. Those are the two big ones in my head, and I still write code as well, so on top of that, which is a challenge. I'm finding that more and more challenging.
Sure, old habits die hard. We did have there was a CTO in one of the engagements that we were on where I had access to his calendar to find white space to book our one-to-ones every month, and I remember looking at it, and he had time blocked so rigorously. It wasn't just every meeting; it was everything. It was foot travel time between rooms. Like, it was phone calls. It couldn't be longer than 4 minutes, and that would be reserved. And then you look for white space and you just can't find it. The whole calendar is just sort of a Tetris grid, because he's got to that level of operational efficiency and organization where every minute is borderline accounted for.
Yeah, and it's sort of going back to my early career. Like, I actually worked as a personal assistant for 2-3 years, so I'm very familiar with what I used to call diary Tetris. Thankfully, I don't have people pressuring me for meetings, all day, every day. So at the moment, I'm getting away with that. But there may come a point where I have to start blocking out my calendar. It hasn't happened just yet, but
give it
keep an eye
time
on that one. We can come back to that in a year's time and see where that is.
Brilliant. Well, Joe, thank you very much for your time and for your insights today.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to register for the podcast, you can find us at release.works/podcast. We've got new episodes uploading every single week. You can find us on StreamYard, YouTube, and Spotify, or any RSS feed where good podcasts can be found. So thank you again.
Thank you.